Welcome to the Savage Worlds GM podcast. I'm your host, Jared Savage Daddy Gunning. And tonight's episode, like all episodes, brought to you by Roll20.net, the world's largest virtual tabletop. Check them out today at Roll20.net. We are on social media. Check us out, SWGM Podcast on Twitter and Facebook. Visit, like, subscribe, share on YouTube, the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Savage Worlds GM Podcast. And the same moniker on Twitter, iTunes.com/Savage Worlds GM Podcast. Tonight's show, if you're watching it live in the broad stream from YouTube, feel free to participate in the chat. We do bring that into the show and include it. And tonight's topic, let there be light. How to do your own world building and not fuck it up, essentially. And here to discuss it with us, Dave, the Rules Maven Scott.
Greetings and salutations.
Dustin, the Savage Zealot Smith.
Ave Maria.
Great pod. And some call him Jib.
How the fuck do you follow that?
You don't. I understand that, you know,
negotiating your clause that you're always introduced before Dustin.
Yeah, next time. Next time I'll introduce you before Dustin.
Okay, yeah, we're going to have to talk about my contract there, Jared.
Yeah. Let's have a discussion after the show.
Okay.
And we're not joined by Chris the Savage Mommy Fox. His freezer ran empty and he's hunting at Gen Con.
Beware.
Yeah, do not get into a lone table game with Chris the Savage Mommy Fox.
Mm-hmm.
His name is Fox for a reason. Okay, so we were talking a little bit in the green room, batting things around, talking about pigeonholing yourself. Gosh, that sounds a lot dirtier than it really is. Pigeonholing yourself and creating and world building. How not to basically paint yourself into a corner as the omniscient, almighty GM who doth create the world and from whose mind doth spring reality. So,
you want to stumble over that a little more, Jared?
Yeah, no, it was excellent. Dustin is going to read from the hallowed book of Hensley regarding world building, otherwise known to the layman as Savage Worlds Deluxe.
Indeed.
So, what is the general advice that the purveyors of Savage Worldry prescribe for world building?
We will find ourselves on the page 128 from the sacred book, and we shall read from that which it says upon the sacred text, design note, the elevator pitch. Thou shalt use the term in Hollywood called the elevator pitch, the idea that thou, when you art young and hungry of screenwriter, that thou doth pitch upon an idea to yon executive. Thou shalt not get in to see him, but yea, one day, when he is in an elevator, thou shalt jump into the elevator while he...
Church!
Distracted, and for 30 seconds thou shalt bombard him with thine great idea. Behold, thou shalt consider these examples from the great book.
Okay, now, Dustin, that was great. Now do it backwards.
Yep, yep, zip, yep, zip, zip, yep, zip, yep, yeah, just yep, yep, yeah.
Number nine.
All right. Effectively, if you, in a little section, if you're going through like the hardcore book, on page 127 talks about creating worlds. The first section is the name, and then we have iconic adventures, genre, and the world. But since we're talking about personal creation, the first thing that players that are creating this should look at is the design note or the elevator pitch, which is try and condense it to a single thought, a thesis for the setting, like Deadlands, weird Western horror where heroes are sometimes so tough they come back from the dead. 50 Fathoms, a fantastic and colorful world is drowning from a witch's curse. Heroes from that world of our own Earth must travel the seas, stopping the flood and defeat the witches. Necessary Evil, when all the superheroes are gone, only the villains can save the world. Weird wars, the violence of war gives rise to dark things. Soldiers, sailors, airmen of every nation must battle the enemies. The first step is the basic gist of it. 1 or 2 sentences to sum up what that world would be.
Okay, we're done. Let's go home.
All right, nice. All right.
Shortest podcast ever. Everybody, thanks for showing up. I mean, that's.
I'm glad you got your money's worth. So
it's definitely, it's not a bad idea to say start with an elevator pitch. I'm going to say I'm going to recommend a different approach.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, get your own ego out of the way. You're not going to create something spectacular that's going to make your players go, ooh. Kind of push that aside, and I would say that you need to make sure that the world that you're building helps lay the foundation for the story you're telling. And that's a little bit in the vein of what Dustin is saying from Savage Worlds, is starting with an elevator pitch. But I would say, if you're creating a game world for a genre, you pretty much have that already in your head from any kind of popular media. If you're going to create a fantasy world, okay, forest, mountains, whatever. If you're doing a sci-fi space opera, then you have this single planet biodome. Oh, this is a desert planet. Oh, this is a forest planet. Oh, this is a snow planet. I mean, all of that stuff is pretty much there. And the world should kind of serve as a backdrop to the story that you're telling based on the genre and what you're telling it in. I don't think you're going to come up with anything. I think it's a trap if you think you're going to come up with some incredible piece of scenery or some incredible world event that is supposed to shock and awe everybody.
I think you're right, Jared. It's the idea of trying to impress people is just going to leave them wondering what's going on. And I think that if you go with the idea of, can we boil it down to simply where the people are, it moves us ahead. The next thing behind that was like, just past the elevator pitch, the very first thing that the book recommends is races, like what races are included. And I'm guessing that's going along with like genre. You in fantasy, Dave, I know a while back you posted, what is the absolute lowest bare minimum race that you can have for it to be a fantasy setting? And I know that I replied that like the basis I think it can be is like elves.
Well, I think that answer is a little too vague, because you're going to run into the group that absolutely doesn't want the, medieval Western fantasy ideal. They're going to want something completely different, and they're going to end up with, cat people and dog people and, there's some kind of a fish creature and things like that, rather than your traditional elves and dwarves and orcs. With that said, though, I think that one of the first things I personally would do, rather than going with the elevator pitch, rather than trying to figure out, what popular media I want to reference and a theme or anything like that, I figure out what's the core mechanic we're going to play with. If I want to run a game that's all about vehicular combat, then at that point I can start building a world that it makes sense that combat happens in vehicles. That's certainly not going to be a traditional medieval Western fantasy. It doesn't mean it can't be a fantasy world, but it's not going to be a traditional medieval Western fantasy because combat didn't happen in vehicles. It might have happened on horseback, but it certainly didn't happen in vehicles in what we would think of in the traditional sense. So I kind of do it in reverse. I figure out what's the mechanic that I want to play with my players around, and I start to build a world around that mechanic. And the elevator pitch idea is great in that it helps you distill down what you're trying to accomplish to a laser focus. The problem is the elevator pitch doesn't teach you what not to do, and that's not to start bolting on all the details. Because I think that's the bigger issue, is it doesn't matter where you start, it's the process in how you build the world so that it's actually playable instead of just, well, I could write a great novel about that world, but it doesn't live and breathe in the way that a game world needs to.
I'd agree. And I'd also say, too, it depends, the overall tone of the game becomes important, too. So if you're going to run something, let's say we're going to run a grim, dark fantasy, then I want to describe landmarks and things of the world. The world should, to me, should reflect that. It should be harsh. Maybe a lot of desert is what I'm going for if I'm going for something gritty. Maybe I'm going for a lot of like jaggedy mountainous terrain, or forests that are practically dead and just gnarled trees, things of that nature. I don't necessarily disagree with Dave about thinking about a mechanic, but I don't think we all necessarily think in terms of mechanics as far as what we're going to be doing in the game. But I agree with Dave, is not to be too specific about the world, because then you're kind of writing the story before anybody sat down to tell you what the story is.
Right.
It's like, oh, you know what? I've got this thing called Star Wars. Forget about it being a space opera. There's this ice planet called Hoth. Now, let me tell you all about this ice planet called Hoth. It's got tauntauns on it. And the temperature at night gets down to negative 30 degrees Kelvin. And nothing survives. And it's this landscape. And it's on the butt end of space. It's out. Okay, that's great. That means nothing without the characters, without the story. So much of your world is backdrop.
You got to think about the great thing about Star Wars is somebody sat down and said, I'm going to write a movie about space wizards using laser swords. And it worked.
Stop and think about this for a second. If you're George Lucas creating the Star Wars game world, and you're doing it from scratch, if we're just talking about Episode 4, A New Hope, he creates literally 2 planets and some starships. And one of the planets is quite literally just a temple in which the Alliance has a base, none of which is fleshed out. It's all backdrop set dressing that doesn't mean shit. The only planet that's actually created is Tatooine, and there's no details on Tatooine other than the fact there's these 2 races, the Sand People and the Jawas, who live in this all-desert planet, and those are the only 2 races we're really going to deal with. The rest of the stuff that we think about as iconic to that planet doesn't actually get created until they come back to it 2 movies later. So you don't need to create that until you come back to your game world 2 campaigns later and need to reuse that material, and you're going to expand on it with the players that are playing. So you have to think in terms of, what are your players actually going to experience? You are not going to sit down and build Fey Run by yourself in a weekend before running a game.
Nope.
That took a gaming company and several professional authors, 25 years now, to craft that world. You cannot compete with not only their level of expertise and creativity, but the amount of time. You are one person. You have to build what your players are actually going to interact with. And that's part of why I said I start with a mechanic. I figure out what's going to be the interesting thing that the players are going to do, and then I build stuff that supports that.
Right. So it's not your sandbox that's important. It's what toys you throw in there to play with. Is there a shovel? Is there a bucket? We're in a huge sandbox, and I can at any time go and say, hey, over this corner of the sandbox is this planet or this thing, and build it right there on the spot. But the players, the children I put in the sandbox, here's a beach ball, here's a shovel, here's a pail, play. Go ahead, Jim. I didn't mean to interrupt.
I take a similar but somewhat different approach. I paint in broad strokes. If I were doing Star Wars A New Hope, when I was creating the world for it, I don't even at the outset. I don't even know what planets there are. Who cares? Whatever. I'll figure that out later. What I know to be fact, though, is that we have this evil galactic empire that's bent on galactic domination. And so if we have an evil galactic empire, we have some rebels who are probably trying to make life difficult for them and overthrow them. And you know what? I'm done.
Yeah.
That's what I know when we sit down. Then we sit down and we start building characters and world building together. And as we do that, I'm sketching in broad strokes things about the world, things that matter to them. Okay? And one of them says, so I want to be from this ancient religion that's died out, but they're, and I'm like, okay, cool. So now we have Jedi. Got that. On that. Cool. Don't really know anything about Jedi yet, but okay, cool. We got that.
I want to be an orphan. Oh, great! So you're Anakin, you're a Skywalker. And now we're depositing on this planet on the bed in space,
after I smack you for wanting to be an orphan, but you get the idea. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start seeding it with things that are of interest to them. Okay, so the difference being, I'm not going to put a bucket in the sandbox if they don't give a shit about a bucket.
Right. I think there's something to be said about 90% of your world building happens between you and the players.
Oh, yeah.
During play, and what you're responsible for when you're doing world building is 10%. And here's the thing, like, stop and really take a look at, say, I'll use a great example here, the Blackwood Errantry Codex that was just released. Eli talked about how over the period of time that he was designing that, he was spending typically at least an hour a day writing. But he wasn't creating the whole world. He was literally creating a baseline so that the players and the GMs could get in there and build their own stories
right
on top of it. He was building the stage upon which the GM was required to make all the set dressing. So you have this idea that you're creating a lot of stuff, but that lot of stuff is not a lot of stuff. It's a very small, narrow band of what you need to actually create.
Yeah. There is one rule for me that is absolute and immutable. Whatever you are building into this world, weave it back to the player characters.
Right.
And there's one single reason for that. Okay? Because I talk to GMs all the time talk about, well, I don't know how to get the characters to buy into my story, and I don't know how to get them to be interested in my game. You want to know how to get them interested in your game? Weave it back to them. Whatever's going on, weave it back to them. Make it things that they care about, that they have said to you matter to them, and weave it back to them. And guess what? They won't have to buy into it because they already own it.
So I'm just going to throw this out there because this is, it's this show. I might as well say it. Stop trying to tell your story and shoehorn them into it.
Exactly.
Start telling a story about them.
And remember, guys, a story is not what you bring into the game. A story is what grows out of the gameplay.
One of the things that I always do with like session 0 and going off of what you guys are saying is I ask my players, what are you guys expecting from this game? And they will kind of like give you hints. Like a lot of players don't really know what to expect, but little kind of trick that works great in Savage Worlds. Look at their hindrances.
Oh yeah.
I'm going to say this. I would say that, and correct me if I'm wrong at any point here, Dave, which I'm sure you will. If you should take the same approach to world building, story crafting, your role as a GM, as one of the things that we preach a lot to our individual game groups. I don't want a 12-page backstory.
Right.
Here's what I want. Do not start with picking your attributes and skills, all that shit to the side. Start with concept. Think of 2 or 3 words that describe the character as a general concept. Drunk fisherman, elderly Walmart greeter, soccer mom, struggling student, whatever. Real simple. Then from there, expand that a little bit and ask yourself, okay, what is this character's personality? How do they interact with the world? How does society react to them?
I get that, Jared, but they may not know. They may not know.
Well, but hold on. Let me finish. And then you get down to a one-sentence blurb about the character that is very intentionally amorphous. So I'm going to do it again with Dave's character description from our original Dead End game. Harry is a middle-aged, obese sanitation worker with no ambition in life except his hobbies of ham radio and fishing. That tells me enough about that character to answer practically any question that comes up during gameplay, and I can graph things on that allow that character to grow organically based on what's happening in the
Sure. I mean, I get that. I would certainly ask the questions that you're talking about, but I'd be prepared for them to maybe not know.
Right.
Well, I think.
But one thing they're going to do and this goes back to what Dave was talking about a minute ago, they're going to pick hindrances. Okay, so like I did a session 0 from a Wild West game that I'm starting this coming Saturday. This was last Saturday when we were doing this. And one of my players said, so, yeah, I think I'm going to have the wanted hindrance. I said, oh, really? By who? You're writing the game for me.
Yeah. So I think to bring this back to world building it's not about asking the players these questions. It's about asking yourself these questions before you create that elevator pitch. What Jared's talking about really is, how do you craft your elevator pitch? It's the same advice we give you about how do you craft your character's background. Make it short, make it sweet. It should be no more than a paragraph. It should literally encapsulate the concept of your game world into that elevator pitch. And then when you sit down at session 0, that's almost all you have. Sure, you might know a few things that you personally want to include. Maybe for you personally, you've always really liked the Blessed from Deadlands. So you know that arcane background is going to be available. Maybe you really hate the chase rules. So instead, you've got this thing where you're only going to use dramatic tasks as chases. So you're going to have that on the table as a setting rule. Maybe you have this great, hog-faced race that has 6 arms that you just absolutely want to get into a game. So that's on the table as a race that your players can play. You've got that information available. And then when you sit down in session 0 and somebody says, well, I'm going to play a character with the wanted hindrance, you create the faction that the player names.
Right, exactly.
And they say, I'm wanted by blah-de-blah. Blah-de-blah is now a faction in your world. Whether that faction is the police or the guards of a particular area, right, or an entire fucking religion, it doesn't matter. You build around what the player wants in the world. That's how that player is always engaged.
Right.
And not only does it exist, does blah-de-blah exist, blah-de-blah matters. Blah-de-blah is important.
Oh yeah, it's going to fucking come up in most of the sessions because you've got a character. Well, depending on whether they take wanted major or minor, it's going to come up in a lot of sessions. Tailor it to that. If they want to take, wanted by the Christian Coalition, and then they're only taking it as a minor, well, the Christian Coalition is probably an offshoot of the main Christian religion rather than being the primary. And it predominantly exists in the southern area of the game world. So that the player characters have the option to interact with that. Whereas if it's the major, maybe that's the actual religion. That's the home of all the religious zealots, and all power is derived from them. Only they have access to being blessed for whatever reason in your game world. Create that shit later. That's a detail. You don't need you don't need the detail about why it works the way it does until a player character gets curious in game and does some research to find out, and then pull it out of your ass. Or my personal favorite, oh, that's a success and a raise. Tell me 2 things about the Christian Coalition that none of us know.
You lazy ass GM.
Why? Okay,
Well,
no.
It invests them.
That's not lazy.
It's brilliant because
It's brilliant
because
if they create it, they own it.
they're invested.
They're invested in it.
Yep. I gotta tell you that will give you some of the best games and some of the best game worlds. In fact, one of the games that I like to play, and I've done this with some people that I was introducing them to Savage Worlds, we would go around 3 times, and you had 3 choices. You could introduce, edit, or veto, and when you introduce, you add some aspect to the world. The next person can either edit, introduce one of their own, or just knock it out. And you can actually make a quick mini game out of that and just sort of like grow things. And it's fun to do that. I think that if you want a more in-depth method, you might want to look at a game called Microscope. I know that Scott has recommended it on here, and like we've talked about in the past, it's not Savage Worlds, but it is fun, and it is like a full-on game in itself. But the whole 3 rounds of world building is just my little quick method of doing it. And the players actually get invested because they are creating what they have to do or what they have to deal with.
So my favorite non-Savage Worlds tool for Session 0, when players are trying to create characters or when we're trying to create the world, Rory's Story Cubes.
Yep.
Because it's literally a handful of dice that are symbols. They're not numbers. They're not words. They're symbols. You hand them to the player who is completely stumped and let them roll and let their imagination go wild on whatever it is they rolled. Now, I will say this. This works great so long as a GM, you have the spine to say no when a player goes too far, and you have the knowledge of when to just say yes and. Because the 2 things go hand in hand. You have to know when to nip it in the bud because that player is either inexperienced with the game, it hasn't played with the gaming group enough, and they want to add something to the game that's just not going to fly. You have to have the spine to say no. But you also have to have the chops as a GM to yes and probably 95% of what they say, especially in that portion of it. I'm not saying that 95 to 5 is the right ratio the rest of the time.
But yes, I totally agree.
It really comes down to that. You've got to yes and most of it and only know the stuff that really is obnoxiously out of line.
Yeah, I agree. I would append that and say that when you say no but.
Yeah.
No, I can't let you do that because it doesn't for this reason, fill in the blank. But we can do this instead.
Mm-hmm. Always offer them an alternative with the no and an explanation. I think those are... You never want to do it in a manner that squashes the creativity your player has brought to the table because, again, what they've just said is what's going to give them connection to the game. It's the reason they want to play in your game. It's because you just let them create the Christian Coalition who live in the South, who have the access to the blessed hindrance or the blessed arcane background. If you just say no and you don't explain to them that, well, the reason I'm saying no is because, well, that is a real world thing, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes. So instead, we're going to say, but what I can do is, well, there is a religion that's predominantly in the South. Can you come up with just a name for them, and they will be the ones who have the blessed? And give them that reason why what they suggested first is getting the no, and then give them an alternative to it. And again, maybe throw it back to them to make some more choices so that they again feel invested. You know, they can then come up with the sect of the Hawk, and that's now the religion that's dominant in the southern part of your world.
Yep.
Jib,
42.
You've played a lot of Fate, right?
Yep.
Don't they have like a section in Fate where they go and the players actually work to create the aspects, the trouble and such for the world?
Yes. Yeah. It's all done together. That's part of the deal with Fate is you have to build everything together. It actually makes it kind of tricky to do a one-shot at a con of Fate because, you know, you're doing the whole thing yourself. But to do a one-shot in Fate, I make the scope small enough and confined enough that it's pretty obvious what it's about. And then I walk through the process by myself, usually bouncing ideas off of a couple of other people as I go, to do the characters and the world and put everything together to fit into place.
Can the same method be used in Savage Worlds?
Yes.
I kind of figured it could. I've tried to do it with some of my gaming groups in the past, and it's odd because sometimes people will actually have this like, okay, so when I was GMing for the Thursday night group, which was predominantly a Pathfinder, there were actually players that were upset with me that I wanted them to invest and sort of have a say in what's in the world. They were like, well, you're the GM. You're supposed to come up with all of that. But then, like, there were some other people who played Fate, and they were all over it. They were like, oh, yeah, man, that's so awesome. I'm going to do this and that. And, like, what do you think of this and that?
Well, people who come from more traditional games, D&D, Pathfinder, even Savage Worlds, are more likely to want or to feel like that's the responsibility of the GM to do. People who come from more indie games are more likely to be like, no, I'll take that. I'll own that.
So I think that there's an aspect of that gets into play style too, because like what we're talking about tonight would never work for a GM like Gary McCallum from the Wild Eye podcast. He very much has to build out everything kind of in rote so that he can build a story that then weaves through it. And while that works for Gary, it's not the style of any of the people on the panel tonight. So I'm really not the one to tell you how to build the best game world for running a railroad, because it's not the kind of game that I play.
I can't help you.
Well, I can add a little bit to that. I think there's a good middle ground to be found between Gary as an example and Dave as an example, and that's to kind of populate a theme park. Treat your world as a theme park and go, hey, I have an idea for this roller coaster ride that's happening over in the Southern Hemisphere, and the whole place has been nuked out, and there's mutants running around there, and pure water is the currency, and there's everybody else is cannibalistic. You can paint in some broad strokes as sort of set dressing for your world without necessarily railroading it all together. Let the players add to that when they walk into that area, but you as a GM still have a pretty defined idea overall generally about what's happening in that that area, that corner of the world. Even to the point where you could maybe come up with some key NPCs, maybe a key villain, and those individual NPCs have motivations based on where they are geographically in your story, if the players ever go there.
Now, I will say the theme park design style that Jared's talking about here is probably the one that's most prevalent in your published materials. Things like, ETU or Deadland. Well, Deadlands is maybe not a great example of this. ETU definitely is. The Savage Worlds version of Rifts, to a certain extent, is a great example, but the Palladium version wouldn't be. And the reason that I say that Deadlands or the old Rifts aren't good examples is they've been around so long, all the details have been filled in. They know where everything is. But if you look at like ETU gives you, here's a gazetter, and these specific locations are all taken care of, but they don't tell you, like, here's a map of the town and everything that's in that town is laid out in the gazetter. No, they hit, 10 or 12 specific locations that are key important things that they've built to be in the world, and then they leave everything else free for the GM to stand up a McDonald's or a Pizza Hut or a Walmart or whatever is necessary for the game to move forward, to exist the way it needs to. You can do the same thing with any setting. You can do these are the things that are important as the GM to the type of thing we're trying to achieve, and set them all out there. And that, again, I think that's what you're going to find in most published settings that are newer. Anything that's older, well, there's a lot more material that exists just because of time and the ability to continue to pour effort into it.
Mm-hmm.
So, not to change the topic entirely, but we haven't really talked about, like, what's the story element of world building?
So, in every story, there is, I guess, what you would call a prime mover. Sauron creates the rings. The Emperor disassembles the Republic. There's some character that has a desire or a motivation that pushes them to affect the world around them. And that's what a prime mover is someone that forces the action or forces the change.
Now, to be fair, the prime mover does not have to also be the antagonist.
Correct.
Both examples that Dustin just gave are of the antagonist as the prime mover. That doesn't necessarily have to be true.
Well, I mean, the title of tonight's show is Let There Be Light, and the prime mover in the book of Genesis is definitely not the antagonist. I mean, starts it up. It's just that the antagonist, in order to be powerful, usually is the prime mover. And if we were going to look at, like, instead of going with episode 4, we went back to episode 1, then the prime mover in episode 1 still would be Darth Sidious, but is more Darth Maul in that particular story. Give or take. We could always blame Jar Jar.
The problem is the easy stories to point to are going to be stories where the prime mover is typically going to also take place as the primary antagonist or the big bad.
Mm-hmm.
I think the danger there that lies there is, and this is something we talked about before, where how to do fiction doesn't always translate to how to do game, is the big bad shouldn't exist in your world before the players do.
Right.
Because the big bad really does need to be a foil for the player characters. And if you've created a big bad, your players don't know how to create foils to it because they don't know what it is. So
I'm gonna posit something here, Dave, and it's kind of like to step on what you're saying a little bit too much, I don't necessarily disagree. But I think that you can do it by having the antagonist, the big bad, pre-exist the player characters. I'm going to say this. I think that you can, if we're talking about story building, as far as a template, what do you use? Then to build the world, to build the story for the world, I say you use the hero's journey.
Yeah.
And you say, hey, there's the known, what's known, the ordinary world. And you just kind of use that hero's journey, and that's by Joseph Campbell. If anybody has never heard of it, George Lucas credits a lot of the storytelling. It's the mega myth that every culture has about oral storytelling, but you have an ordinary world. So let the players craft that ordinary world. The prime mover can be the unknown, or that threshold that they have to cross over in order to get into the world of adventure.
The call to
action, overcoming the threshold guardians, so to speak, traveling into the dangerous unknown world, coming back victorious as a hero. I mean, if you want to use Greek myth as an example, you could take the Perseus story, the attack, what they call it, Attack of the Titans, the movie they made out of it, right? And you can say, hey, there's this ordinary world, and it's being threatened because now the gods decide to become vengeful. And there's your world story. That's your world story. And then, your heroes spring up out of it. I don't think that you can plan. I don't think you can plan the story part of world building as completely as you can plan the group or the party or the events that they take place in, because the world reacts to them.
Yeah, as I might have mentioned before, the story is what grows out of the gameplay. So what I want to know is, who are the people? Who are the people, and what do they care about? So now we've got, this religious faction that Dave was talking about. Who's in charge? Who's in charge of this religious faction? Who's the top person? What do they care about? What do they want? What are they trying to accomplish with this religious faction that they have?
And that character can't exist until the player has sat at session 0 and created the faction over which that character is going to exist. And I think that's the difference between what Jared's talking about and what I'm talking about is the antagonists, the bad guys, or even just the important NPCs don't exist until the seeds have been sown during session 0 for what's going to be important to the story the players want to explore.
Okay, so, I'm gonna argue that a little bit, and I'm gonna argue that a little bit based on something Jim has said on this podcast more than once. Here's how I pitch a story. Hey, this is what's happening in this world. Create characters who would get involved with that.
Right. This is what's happening in the world, but not the story. I know that we've got a religious faction, because we kind of talked. We might have mentioned that, or I might have had that idea, and. But until I get the player characters, I don't know who the people involved are.
Why not?
What they care about.
Okay, but why not?
All right.
I'm just playing devil's advocate here, by the way.
So
why not?
Why not? The simple why not is I can pour weeks in developing the perfect religion. And if none of my players take that religion or the opposing religion, it'll never come up in the game.
Wow.
I can create the city of Waterdeep, and I can pour all my effort into creating the big-ass dungeon beneath the city of Waterdeep, and all the different lords of Waterdeep who are vying to be the High Lord. I can create all of the magnificence of the pirates and the coast around it. And if my players decide that they want to play Drow Elves in the Underdark, Waterdeep's doing me fuck all as a GM. It's going to go in the tin box, and it's only going to come out when they ever get there.
The 13th Warrior.
I can't force my players to play where the big bad was created. I can't force them to be interested in the story the big bad was created near.
I just love it because it's just that point of like the GM is like, okay, so what do you do now? It's like, well, after I get back from the cantina, I'm going to come back to the moisture farm. Like, well, aren't you going to go on the adventure? It's like, no, I'm just going to keep farming the moisture. All right, Aunt Beru and Uncle Owen are just dead. You arrive and they're dead. Why are they dead? Because you have to
I am
leave.
driving your ass onto my storyline. That's why.
So I'll say this. Okay, so just as a counterpoint. Okay, there's a big religious organization that controls the largest city in this world. And it's a complete oligarchy. And the head of the religious order has decreed that he is going to rise from the dead, and he's very near death. And his underlings, the real power behind the throne, are trying to find somebody who looks just like him, but a younger version, because they know he's not going to resurrect. And then, bam, I've got the character. One of the characters looks like him before the characters are created, and I draw the characters in that way.
Okay, but herein lies the rub for that. Unless that was your elevator pitch, it simply doesn't work. If your elevator pitch is, hey guys, we're going to play a gritty real-world drama centers on religion, that's an elevator pitch. You just created this entire religion that if none of us create a character that fits that, you're now stuck with having done work that doesn't actually fit in the game you're going to run. And that's what we're talking about here, is the pitfalls of overbuilding too soon or building in the wrong directions.
Right.
Okay.
And how many GMs have we talked to over the years who've said, "Oh, I built all this shit for my game and they didn't even use it. They didn't even go where I put, the town that I made for them." I'm like, well, you made a town that they didn't care about.
It's great to build. I know I'm going to have a greedy shopkeeper and a generous shopkeeper. Both own shops in whatever town the players are in. And the greedy shopkeeper is going to have better quality stuff in their store because they've been able to take in enough stuff and be successful enough that they have more money to spend than the generous shopkeeper. But the generous shopkeeper needs the player's help and is therefore going to be even more generous. They're going to get a deeper discount. I might know those two things as a GM is part of the world building I do before I ever set the table. That stuff is fine to build. But I'm going to build this religion, well, again, unless someone's going to interact with it, that's all wasted. You know the players are going to interact with a bar.
Right.
No, they're going to interact with the store.
The only time it wouldn't be wasted is if it's background.
Right. Like I create the Jedi Order and then I bring it all the way forward. The game is not about them playing Jedis or it's in that religion, but the Jedi Order is a religion in that world as a backdrop, and they've been eradicated. And every once in a while, you see a dude in a cloaked hood walking around with a laser sword.
Well,
and that's the crux, though. If they're not going to see it, then it didn't need to exist. For you to say there's a guy in the background in a hood and a cloak with a laser sword who might be a Jedi, you don't need to know who Darth Vader was, how the Jedi rose to power, how they fell, what the Jedi Creed was, what the Sith Creed was, who the Sith Order were, all that detail that goes into building the Jedi Order. Hey, that's great mental masturbation, but if it's never going to actually make it to be player-facing, it simply doesn't matter and shouldn't be built before your game starts, because at that point, you've wasted effort that could have been spent building things that are actually going to be player-facing, or you've wasted effort in that you've built something that maybe doesn't even fit in this game anymore.
Right.
And for anybody listening, everything I'm proposing and arguing about, I have no belief in whatsoever. I'm doing it for sake of argument to get a conversation going.
Now, one thing that I might do, and that is if I'm cooking the ideas that I've gotten from the player characters, and something occurs to me, like I'm doing a fantasy world and they're all elves, and so they've been talking about what the elves are like and whatnot, and I go, hey, it might be an interesting counterpoint to that if there's some conflict with dwarves over there. I don't really know all that much about it yet, but that might be an interesting thing. As I have thoughts about dwarves, I might note them down, but they are subject to change.
Yeah. But that's the thing. Like, having a skeleton of an idea is different from having fleshed out an entire religion or an entire city that's never going to be player-facing. And totally that, I think, is the point I'm trying to make here, is don't get yourself so lost in the details of building this amazing thing that may never actually be put in front of the player characters, and therefore simply doesn't matter for that game. If you're trying to build a world as a game designer, this podcast is not for you. I am not trying to explain how to develop your own world to publish later on. This is specifically how to do it as a GM with a group of players that are going to sit down at your table. So that's another aspect of this I definitely want to drive home is I'm not saying that these are horrible things to create. I'm saying they're not necessary if they're never player-facing and your only focus is as a GM with the people who are actually going to sit at your table and play.
Right. So let's say I come to a table and I go, I got my regular group of Thursday, Friday, Saturday night players, and we've all decided, hey, we want to play in a low magic fantasy setting. Or we want to play in a high magic fantasy setting. And then we build this by committee. And then the players go off the rails and sidestep and backstab everything they said they wanted in this game and start doing shit because, well, I said there was no magic, right? We said there was no magic. We agreed no magic, right? Okay, but I got this book, so I'm going to cast a spell. Wait a minute.
Okay, that's
so there
different.
was no magic.
Okay,
how is
that's
that different?
You've set an expectation between the group, for the entire group, between all of you, that says this is a low magic world. Mm-hmm. Okay? They're not...
Get ready, Dave. Go ahead, Jim.
They're not adding elements to the game. They're breaking the implicit contract of play.
Right, because they're used to playing in another setting that shall not be named. Where
so you have to reel them back. So at that point, you have to reel them back. So that's when you say, no, but it's an interesting book about something that's relevant to the storyline. To the evolving story.
Go ahead, Dave.
So, one, while this is absolutely a direct quote of something that happened in a game that I ran, I do want to call a little bit of foul play because it wasn't a Savage Worlds game.
I agreed.
It was a game about players being able to create the mechanics on the fly as they played.
Right.
So it made a little more sense for the player to do what they were doing, but absolutely it was a gaming faux pas for the player to say, this is a game where the only magic is alchemy, and then I want to cast spells.
I want to do a sleep spell.
These two things don't go together. You can brew a potion or craft a powder that does that if you want, and then sprinkle it wherever you want to put it, but you can't violate the rules of the world we created together for the game. And by extension, to bring this back more towards Savage Worlds, is you can't create something during play that's a direct contradiction to that implicit contract of play. The stuff that everybody kind of agreed on at the start of the game. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have things that are way off the rails. You know, you're playing the zombie apocalypse, and you suddenly run into, in a Romero Walking Dead-esque zombie apocalypse, you suddenly run into a city full of elves. That's a little weird. It's way off the track. In fact, it's almost a 90-degree left turn or right turn, depending on the way you look at it. But at the same time, it could be really interesting to figure out how in the world elves existed and how they ended up in a zombie apocalypse. But be aware, zombies are going to show up where the elves are, and then you're going to have immortals battling the undead, and that's a completely different game. But you have to be aware of what violates the central tenet and what doesn't. If we said we're going to play in the real world and someone wants to create elves, okay, so this is a group of people who are
cosplayers
lived and have, you know, curved ears, or they're cosplayers or whatever, but they certainly don't have magic and they're not immortal. If,
right.
you know, so take those steps as necessary, but when they go the full mile, the full Monty to completely go against what's in the world, absolutely, that's, again, you got to have the strength of the spine to say, no, that just doesn't exist in this world for this reason. This is what we all agreed to play. Hey, we're playing ETU. We're not playing Scooby-Doo. So I need you to stay within the theme of what we're doing. You know, that sort of a thing is appropriate. And this is why I had said it earlier on that while during session 0, it's a 95 yes and a 5% no but, in play, it's a lot more mixed and gray. And I'm not going to give you 50-50 or 60-40.
It's not even consistent. It's fluid.
Yeah,
it depends largely on you know what's going on.
You have to know which tool is the right one to reach for as a GM. And the only thing that teaches you that is putting your butt in the seat behind the screen.
Right?
Yeah. Now,
and the answer is always a hammer, big hammer. Go ahead.
Going back to the thing about, you know, you're doing a zombie apocalypse game and somebody all of a sudden cooks up elves. Okay. Let's assume for a second that it's not abjectly impossible. Okay. It's not, you know, 21st century North America, but even if it was, maybe even if it was, somebody cooks up the idea of there being a village of elves. Why are there elves here? Why could there possibly be elves here? Because if we can come up with something that serves the game, and they're there, and everybody else is like, I'm down with this plan.
Wait a minute.
I'm probably going to run with it.
Oh, yeah.
So what you're saying is in the midst of a zombie apocalypse set in modern day times, that you could run across a survivor community who fancies themselves medieval kingdom people, where they actually have a king and they talk thusly and thouly, and they have knights, and the king has a tiger, and the place is literally called a kingdom.
I mean, certainly.
Yeah. Wait. There are elves in 21st century North America? How the hell did that happen?
And that's the question you ask your player when they introduce it to the game.
Right.
And that's the thing. Ask the player, wait a minute, how does that fit with what we're doing? And if they can answer, you give a question that an answer to that question that satisfies everybody at the table, fucking run with it. Have fun. This is probably the quintessential piece of advice that comes out of any of this. And that is, you're sitting at this table to play a game which is supposed to be fun, not just for you, but for everybody there. So make sure everybody's on board with whatever it is you're doing. Don't build into your world something that violates the fun of anyone sitting at that table. Matthew Colville talks about this a little bit in a video he put up about a year ago, where he talks about the whole discrimination thing and how you run into this idea, well, women were poorly treated in medieval times, therefore in our medieval game, women aren't equal. Or in the 1950s, there was racism, so in our game of the 1950s mob, we're going to have racism. No. If the people at the table don't want to explore that, then don't explore it. And even if they do, find out why. Because if they want to explore it just because they want to be a horrible human being for an hour, that's not going to be fun for you as the GM facilitating it. So make sure that whatever you include makes sense. If you want to have racism and you want to have elves hate dwarves and dwarves hate elves for some ancient slight that happened, rock out. That can be a very fun thing to explore. But at the same time, if someone at the table is not going to enjoy it, throw it the fuck out of your game and put something in that's going to be interesting to everybody.
You know, something that you can do, like the dwarves and the elves, the reason why they hate each other, one accuses the other of cheating at poker. Culturally, they're just like, well, that side cheats.
Okay, so we're getting close on time. I think everything we present tonight works good in theory. I'm wondering if we could maybe do a real quick do it in practice.
Okay, so I'm going to say this, since we're all GMs here, and we've got a couple of people who've been fairly active in chat. We have 11 people watching. I want chat to give us character synopsis statements about who their characters are very quickly. And then we're going to build a world that interacts with those characters.
Now, do we want to establish a genre, a loose genre of some kind as a framework? So
sure.
That, you
haven't been here for a bit. Give us the elevator pitch for the world that these players need to make characters for.
It's a medieval fantasy world, but it's more Mad Max like post-apocalyptic because magic has literally been the nuclear bomb that's destroyed the world and sent it into an apocalypse. Go.
Now let's see if we get any responses from chat as to characters.
So any race that you would find in a standard fantasy, medieval fantasy, Tolkien, D&D style fantasy is acceptable. Okay. But it's a Mad Max-like landscape because magic has been a nuclear bomb that's been dropped and blowing everything to shit.
Okay.
Okay, so we got Octavius Prime suggests a drug addict who scavenges the ruins for artifacts that get in quick cash.
Okay.
Okay.
Probably magical artifacts, leftover magical artifacts that survived. Maybe not.
Specify, but we can go with either. Maybe what he scavenges for isn't the magic artifacts, but scrolls and tomes and ancient knowledge.
Hold on a second, guys. His character is a drug addict, and magic is what's killing the world. Why not have him just look around for bits of the magic or whatever the magical substance is that's weaker that you can get high off of?
So that's his drug is crystallized mana that's been chopped up into a fine powder that he snorts. So now we have the idea that there is crystallized mana in the world. That has to be a thing for him to have a drug addict character that has a drug based off of it.
And also you have quests because and hazards because people will be compelled to go into that area to get the drugs. But if it's too potent in that area, players are going to be dying.
Well, and he says he does this for quick cash as well. So we have to assume that there's something else he's bringing out treasure-wise.
Right.
Sellable, because he's not going to sell the thing he's addicted to.
Well, we also obviously have a market for the thing that he's addicted to. So there's a market for that, but I also get the impression that it's illegal.
Right.
Yeah, I love the idea that it's illegal. Now, Mel throws out that he's a mutated gnome that fixes up old alchemical vehicles with less magically based technology. So at that point, that means we have mechanical technology in the world, and it also means we have mutation. So there's some form of maybe twisted magic left over from the apocalypse that he's not just a gnome, he's a mutated gnome. So there's now maybe a mutation mechanic that you're going to want to throw together based off of the random card draw or something. I know there's a mutation deck that exists from one of the licensees.
Right.
Okay.
So it's a mutation.
That could be radioactive mana, right?
Okay. It's an alchemical vehicle that's less magically based. Mel, you're talking about a motorcycle, aren't you?
I mean, to be fair, what he's talking about is the Tron bike that you're taking away the electric motor and putting in a non-magic
A
motor,
combustion,
a combustion engine on bike. But I mean, that's great. Now we know we have proper technology, what we would think of as maybe medieval levels or a little bit higher, maybe a steampunk-esque sort of thing, as well as a functional type of mana that you can find and refine into an illegal substance that you get high off of. Now, more than likely, Octavius's character is either bringing out physical mana that he's selling that he doesn't have the ability to process. That's how he's getting the quick cash to buy his next fix. Or he's bringing out some form of treasure, which could be the parts that Mel is needing so that he can do these things. So now we've got a reason for these two characters to pal around together and work together.
Now, if there's also a market for mana to be chopped up and crystallized mana to be chopped up, then there's a syndicate that exists in that world, right? A black market?
He just actually created that for us. He said that he owes a lot of money to the Grand Wizard Full, so he takes a lot of risks to get the cash. So he goes into really risky dungeons or ruins. So there's another hazard that makes these risky that we have to come up with. Maybe there's a time distortion in all of them that's based on how much magic was there.
Okay.
But Fall might be maybe not a big bad, but certainly an important NPC. Well, he doesn't even have to be a lieutenant to the big bad, but he's an important NPC. We need to know who Thal is and what he cares about. The Jip thing. Who is he? What does he care about?
Well,
he's the Grand Wizard. He is a Grand Wizard, but what's he the Grand Wizard of?
Okay. In this society, if it's magical, Grand Wizard and Mayor are probably going to be a similar, or if not the same title. And Reuben is a former orcish raider masquerading as a faith healer, so I'm pretty sure...
Raider Magi.
You
gotta put that in there. He's using magic on the sly as if he's a holy man trying to disguise it through chanting and whatnot. So now you've got a character that has an illegal form of arcane background, perhaps.
Which would probably bring him into conflict with the Grand Wizard if we wanted to make him the town leader or the person who's in charge by merit of being the most powerful magic user.
Well, now... you could go that direction, or we could go the direction that the Grand Wizard is inherently the head of an outlaw cabal because he's a wizard, and maybe he has that same illegal arcane background that Reuben has just built for his own character. But unlike Reuben's character, who's using the trapping of I'm disguising it as clerical, this Grand Wizard Thal doesn't disguise it at all. So now we have a Grand Wizard who is that nasty head of a cartel, like Jared was saying. He's the Godfather, the Pablo Escobar of our world.
Anyone else throw anything into the ring?
No, I think that's got it.
Yeah.
All right, so a party of 3 in that world. Okay, so we've got characters, we have motivations. Now, how do we build the world? So beyond what we've already just come up with just naturally from what they've given us?
I think we need 2 things. We need a centralized location that they rest at. The town, the village, whatever it is that they're gonna be based out of. And then we need the first place that they're going to go in search of the riches that Octavius's character needs to pay off Thal, and which Mel's character needs to be able to build things, and they've maybe hired Reuben's character because he's a cleric and he can do the holy rite over the mana to make it transportable.
Well,
so,
one thing we got to ask though is, do they know that he's a former raider? Because if he's a former raider, he has knowledge of where the safe areas are and aren't, which also means there are other raider tribes which are hazards.
That could be too.
Yeah, I would throw in other magic raider tribes, sort of like very primitive tribal Native American tribes, like spread out all over the place with individual tribal pride and issues. I hate this tribe. Why? Because they're that tribe.
They
They're not
cheated
my
cards.
tribe.
Just note that at exactly the level Jared just rattled it off, and leave it there until they run into one. And
Now,
then,
I might.
And everybody's terrified of the ice reavers. Nobody knows why.
Okay, works for me.
Just to put a major thing out there in the world, I like that. Yeah.
Right.
Now,
I'll also say this too. I envision a possible meta plot issue where there is a cabal or a big bad leader or a star chamber bent on bringing magic back into the world.
I think so. Yeah.
And
Sounds reasonable to me.
there's a maybe 3 or 4 artifacts that they have to collect and do a ceremony, and our player characters end up grabbing one of the very important artifacts. Now, is that too railroady? Here's the question. That's why I'm throwing it out there, because we're building a big bad based on the characters first and then the world as well.
So this is the direction I would take that, Jared. If you want to build a big bad that has the 3 artifact thing, Thal has a overlord he answers to that informs him while the group is out doing their first little mission at the first hazard we create. So that when they come back and Octavius makes his payment, Thal says, "This isn't enough, but I'll tell you what, I'll clear your debt if you bring me MacGuffin A." And now we've tied all of it together to this meta plot you're trying to build.
Right.
As a GM, you've now given the player characters a reason to get involved with that meta plot, but you haven't put so much time and effort into the meta plot that if the player characters say, "No, we'd rather take our time paying this off," that you've done a lot that's going to be wasted.
I kind of want to add a little bit here based off of what Mel just said. Mel says, we have a guild of tinkerers that are doing our best to convince people that these new vehicles aren't powered by dangerous magic. Okay? I want to kind of take that, and I want to say that there is a group that works that doesn't seem to be related to Thal, but they're related to his boss, and the boss is a disembodied spirit that wants tinkerers to build a mechanical body that they can inhabit. And the parts that need to be found, the magical parts, allow that big bad to bridge the gap between the artificial body and the spectral body.
See, and I would only add that once the players have agreed to Thal's option to go get the MacGuffin. I would also say this, though, that what Mel added absolutely means that we create a secondary faction that exists somewhere that stops you from using magical items and vehicles because of how dangerous they are. A version of this world's zealotry that is absolutely anti-magic focused and shakes Mel's character down quite often because he's constantly in flux with items that used to be magical and aren't anymore. So he and the Tinkerers Guild have had lots of run-ins with this opposing guild that is a group of zealots that are absolutely trying to purge the world of what magic is left to save it.
I agree. I like what Ruben's thrown in there with magic is waning in the world, so elves suffer. Now cannibalistic and feral-like. I would say, yeah, you don't go in the forest in this world because they're occupied by feral cannibalistic elves.
See, now here's where I would say no to Ruben, is where he wants the forests to be going away. I would say no, the effect the magic has already had on those is there, and there is a wasteland, but the wasteland isn't growing from that. And the no but would be, but technology is slowly coming up to a point where deforestation is going to start to be an issue. So it's not that the forests are shrinking and that magic is tied to the forests. It's that the forests are shrinking, and that's making the elves even more, tribalistic and striking out at people who are deforesting the world.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't like the idea of magic being specifically tied to
nature,
the trees. I might want to tie magic to when the last dragon dies, or the core of the earth stops spinning the right direction, or something else later on. I just want to leave myself free to do that later. I don't want to make that decision now, so I also don't want to let that decision be tied to these trees.
And that way you're not pigeonholing yourself into a meta plot or a campaign world. You're leaving it open.
I have built myself into a corner, and I've said no enough to not let the players build us into a corner, where now I have to tell a story about how all the trees are disappearing and taking away the home of the elves.
But you could go into the horror companion. They have the living topography. The forest could be literally fighting back when you get there. And the elves are considered allies.
It's not that Ruben's idea is bad. It's just that's my example of where I would say no, but, and this is why.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I agree completely with Dave, because what you're doing is just saying, I'm not removing that as a possible story element. I'm changing the conditions where you're trying to introduce it and make it very, very specific. I want to make it more broad and open so I can introduce it when it makes sense to the story. Yeah. All right. Oh, there's an example.
That was a quick and dirty, and there's your session 0, folks. I mean, quite literally, we did this with the delay of having to wait for chat to get back to us. That's the effect of a full session 0. It took 5 minutes.
Right.
You can do, I hear people talk about how, well, session 0 is 4 hours of gameplay that we lost. No.
Well, it can be.
Session 0 in a half hour if I've got.
You take what time you need for your session 0. In this case, we kind of abbreviated the discussion part of it.
Oh, yeah.
A bit.
Well, and I think an aside to that, too, though, is while your session 0 takes as long as it takes, it should also be fun.
Yeah.
This should not be... I have sat in on session 0s where no one's talking.
And that's totally not... That's not even a session 0.
That's a group
you're not doing the thing.
Night to do, separate things all by themselves and aren't interacting with each other.
Right.
A true session 0, there should be a lot of conversation that links things together and builds that world. And if that's not happening, don't expect to have a great game going forward, because you've done a poor job of doing the setup for a great game. Right. You haven't let the players interact with each other to find out how their characters are intertwined. You haven't let the players intertwine their characters with the game world. And you haven't built your game world based on what the characters are making for choices.
Right. And then so the GM version of this world building is to turn to the players these 3 specific character concepts and go, all right, great. Why are the 3 of you all adventuring together? Why are you all together? You're from these 3 disparate.
Now we've gone to a part of session 0 that's because session 0 is character and world building. Part of character building is creating the links between the characters. Okay. And that's when you forge that. That's when you create that thing.
Right. Now, as a GM sitting here on that session 0, I've got a notepad off to the side and I'm scrolling weird science, arcane background, maybe miracles plus magic, arcane background. I'm making notes about what mechanics are going to be important in this play as well. I might have to ask myself where we're going to do vehicle rules, since vehicles are going to play a heavy part in this. How are the vehicles powered? Are they run off power points? I mean, I'm going to be making little notes and questions to myself about how to make this game happen at the table when we actually sit down to play it as well, right?
And I'll be honest with you. It's a proper session 0. You're going to have those answers before the session is even half done. Because if you don't know what arcane backgrounds you're including, the players don't know what arcane backgrounds they're building the character around. So, Mel's character that's this tinker needs that weird science arcane background to be available if you're going to have that be what handles tinkering in the game. So those are decisions you're going to have the wherewithal as a GM, not just to jot down the notes, but then to make those decisions in rapid fire succession, because that's a central part of what this is. You know, that's you going, okay, they want tinkering, I'm going to make that an arcane background by calling it weird science. Or they want tinkering, okay, that's just going to be repair rolls.
Right.
Bam, moving right along. That way they can build the character, because they're going to ask you what's available for that character.
Right. And then I might go, well, if I'm going weird science and this thing, okay, I'm going to actually make sure that I point Mel in the direction of maybe Gadgeteer as an edge, Mr. Fix-It, MacGyver, Scavenger may be an important edge to have in this game. I'm going to have to make those rapid fire decisions based on my understanding of how Savage Worlds works.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not an easy thing. That's something you learn over years of running games and getting really, really familiar with the way the rule system works.
Yep. You just learn by doing.
I will be brutally honest for a second as well. The other thing you want to do if you're going to take on what we just did is you're going to want to have a wide base of Savage Worlds that you know. Core does a lot, but if I also know that, hey, wait a minute, they want to make an illegal magic user that hides what they do, I might immediately think I might pull some things out of the Hex Slinger from Deadlands to make this work. Maybe I get rid of the card mechanic and just go pure power points, and I can make some tweaks as necessary. But those are the things you're going to want to have a wide base of knowledge for, because while you may not be playing Deadlands with that group, there might be something from that absolutely gets brought over. Right. Another great example is, we talked about how there's these hazards in the world. Maybe those suffer a magic level instead of a fear level that makes all hazards that much more potent. It's not that there's a magical hazard, it's that all the normal hazards are far more potent because of the magic around them.
Right.
You might just create that, again, drawing from a mechanic that already exists in a Savage setting and create, your version of it for your game.
Right. And you could get, and here's the other thing too. Savage Worlds is fluid enough in this particular setting. Let's say that I say, hey, you know what? Based on what you told me, there's this magical area where the biggest part of the explosion happened that destroyed the world, destroyed magic. And we call this the Desert of Despair. And in the Desert of Despair, anything that you eat causes fatigue from hunger because it's mutated and weird. So if you eat a salamander from the Desert of Despair, you can get sustenance from it after you make a vigor roll against hunger, because it's a weird thing that happens here. I'm just saying, don't be afraid to create something that's unique based on the rule system in a way that makes sense for what you're playing. Or, water makes you more thirsty if you fail the vigor roll.
Don't feel confined by the physics of the real world. Don't feel confined by the expectations of popular fiction. But also, these are conversations to have with the players so they know going in, these things exist in the world, and is that something they want to play with?
Right.
Again, this is where my personal pet peeve about obfuscation really comes out, in that it's okay to have surprises for the characters. And it's okay to have unknown knowledge out there somewhere. But key important things that you're going to add to the game, especially around mechanics, you don't hide that from your players. Otherwise, you could very well spring that on them in the middle of the session, and all of a sudden, you've lost your whole table because you've used a mechanic they just have no interest in playing with.
Right. And it doesn't have to be anything ingenious or overly complicated. I'll give you an example. They could enter an area where gravity has half the normal gravity. So now pace is doubled because of gravity. They can make a single strength roll and use it like the levitate or teleport power as far as how much distance they cross. And that could be something that's fun for the player characters to get involved with. If you've ever seen the John Carter's a Mars movie, the first moment when he lands on Mars and goes to take a step and catapults himself through the air, and then that's also an explanation why he can do all this crazy superhero style bullshit, because gravity. So, I mean, don't be afraid to play with something like that as well and put it out there if it's fun for the players, if it makes sense. I'm not saying just do it for the sheer sake of doing it, but if it makes sense in the world that you're creating and you have the player character buy-in, have fun with it.
Well, and to a certain extent, there is a case for just do it for the shits and giggles of doing it. If you're playing this world that we've just talked about, maybe it really does work for you to have floating islands, and that's something you've always wanted to include as a GM, but you've always played real world settings. Well, now you've got a world that's been torn apart by magic. Well, one of the things it did, there's now this fucking floating continent off to one side.
I tell you,
the planet.
I'll tell you what, I want to go with this one if we're still adding. All right.
Air sharks.
Yes, air sharks that have to be milked. The Desert of Despair is the epicenter, is the target that was hit by the magical attack is a citadel, a giant, congruent, like wizarding city. And now, because the magic hit it, parts of the citadel are floating over the desert.
Yeah. Sure, why not? And they have the sweetest tomes.
Right. And you have to check through those, so you have to go from one to the other.
Right.
And there's bound to be things that have been pulled from other dimensions because that's where the magic hit.
Right. And you've got guardians of the lore that are riding around literally on air sharks.
Mm-hmm.
And they're zombies riding around on air sharks. Why? Because Savage Worlds, bitches.
Because it's a role-playing game, for fuck's sake.
At this point, because you can.
Fucking rule of cool. Just like there's rule of cool when you're describing what happens after the dice are rolled, there's rule of cool when you're just creating the world. Create something that's interesting and pops.
All right. Well, I think
one thing I would try to not do is try to out clever them.
Right.
Don't try to dazzle them with your brilliance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just aim for
the lowest common denominator
and meaning.
Yep. Yeah. Trim the fat, as they say in Deluxe.
Because I promise you, whatever the thing that you think is so cool and awesome and is going to just dazzle them, they're going to go, oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
the KISS method works really well in this situation.
Yeah.
Keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah, until I bring out the bunny that,
kills
everybody. Oh, look at it. It's a cute, fuzzy bunny. No, it's a killer. All right. So Monty Python reference unlocked. All right. So until next time, this is Jared Savage Daddy Gunning for Dave, Dustin, and Jib saying keep rolling, stay savage.